to be introducing my dear friend and colleague, Tomas Demonchaux. As we've kind of already mentioned, Tomas is coming to us live from New York, where it's 11 p.m. at the moment. So thank you, Tomas, so much for taking your time and before bed to be with us.
I'm already asleep. This is just a dream for me.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. I've known Tomas for quite a long time, many years. And as we were just talking about, he actually was my teacher at one point. We were colleagues. Now we're very good friends. We do work together. All right. And fortunately, as I mentioned to you guys previously, he's been dropping into our studio quite a bit this semester. And so my group has gotten to know him quite well, which is very lucky for us. Just to give you a little bit of his background. Yeah, he does get a little bit cranky late at night, but that's okay. So Tomas is, you can probably hear from his accent a little bit. He studied in his early life in Sydney and still calls Australia home. He trained as an architect at Princeton University and Brown University, and was raised in a family of architects and urbanists. He teaches at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and is an award-winning design writer and critic. He's the recipient of the Winterhouse Award for Design, Writing, and Criticism, and of a Graham Foundation grant, among other honors, and is a past guest editor of the SOM Journal. His writing has appeared in N+1, Architect, The New Yorker, The New York Times, and now Places, where he is the inaugural 2021 critic-in-residence for architecture. So I'm so looking forward to hearing him speak on The Spinning Rainbow of Death, Notes on Color. So please join me in welcoming Tomas Demonchaux online.
Thank you. Always delightful to hear about oneself if one is a Leo like me. And a real joy and a very special privilege to be kind of a stowaway at Newcastle with your studio this semester, and it's just been wonderful to get to know your students, and the work they're doing is amazing. You have to forget that I said that when I turn back into your critic, but it's extraordinary work. And it's been wonderful to learn more about Newcastle and about studying architecture in Australia. So thank you for letting me join you from my midnight kitchen. And I see that this lecture series is sort of architects and experts parachuting into Newcastle. And I certainly claim to be an architect. I do not claim to be an expert, either an expert architect or indeed an expert in my chosen subject, which is color. I thought I'd talk about color because of the theme of Billy's section in the studio that you are working on, which has to do with perception and the difference between objective and subjective, formal and informal, the real and the perceived, phenomenology, and the trickiness and the magic of that, and the idea of smoke and mirrors. And color is one of these categories of experience and of the world and of design that is weird and complicated. And a lot of architects are sort of afraid of color. And you can see that in how they dress, and we're going to talk about that. It's a little bit taboo color. It's a fun subject and it's a serious subject. And so I've just been thinking about it for a while, and I wanted to share those thoughts with you. They're all thoughts in progress. I want to hear your thoughts. I hope we have time. It's a sort of open-ended discourse. I want to share with you about 25 images and some quotes, and we'll see where we get. I'm going to plow through about 300 years of social, cultural, and design history. It's a fairly Eurocentric narrative because that's the narrative that I'm interrogating. But I think that's an important thing to see and say. And then before getting into the strange image before us, and I've learned this from Billy, he's modeled this for me, and American universities are actually learning this from Australian universities, which is just to tell you about the land that I'm on. And its indigenous history. So I'm on Manhattan Island, Mannahatta is a word in the Lenape language. The Lenape were the people who lived here for the last 40,000 years. And their nation kind of spread from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, all the way down to Delaware. And they were displaced from Manhattan and walked the Trail of Tears, as it's called, about 4,000 kilometers west to Oklahoma. And there's maybe about 20,000, depending on how exactly one understands it, Lenape today. And there's 20 million people in New York City. So that's just something to think about. And we're going to talk a little bit about America's heritage in this way, because the word with which these indigenous Americans were once called was in the language of color, involving the word red. And some of the compound words are now unspeakable words, fortunately. But this association from the very beginning between personhood and color and the languages of identity is something that I'm going to try to come back to at the end of our talk. And that's serious business, and we'll try to do justice to it, as well as look at some weird and wonderful things along the way. So, Spinning Rainbow of Death, that's the title of our talk. And that is that irritating little circle that you see on this picture. I think Billy's going to indicate it with his little hand. And so this is a magic trick, right? Like the spinning rainbow of death is what your cursor turns into when your computer is freaking out or about to die or making you nervous. So just seeing this little spinning rainbow of death should hopefully be triggering some of you. Hackers call it that. It's also called the spinning wheel of death, the bouncing beach ball of death, the spinning color wheel of death. But it's always of death, and it's always spinning, and it's a rainbow. And this is a photo that I took of my own computer screen when I was downloading the images I wanted to share with you this afternoon. You can see my open tabs up there: Theory of Color, Vision Science, Untitled. And I was trying to download this file from Wikipedia, and my computer freaked out. And I at least had the presence of mind to photograph my computer with my phone, because this was my subject that had volunteered to show itself, which is the spinning rainbow of death, as called by hackers. And of course, everything has a history, even the stupid icons that we use on our Macintosh computers. And the spinning rainbow of death goes all the way back at least to 1772, which is this image that was on my computer screen that I failed to download because my computer freaked out, but I did take a photo on my iPhone. And it was drawn by someone with the irresistible name Ignaz Schiffermüller, Versuch eines Farbensystems, which is an attempt at a color system, 1772. And there were many such attempts in the second half of the 18th century. And in the engraving, there are these little cherubs, I hope you can see them, that are doing different things that we can do with light. And remember that the 18th century is the age of enlightenment. And they called it that at the time. So there was a figurative and a literal fascination with light. And it was a enlightenment of intellectual and political and economic and social theory, and even in some cases, justice. So these are like the four things you can do with light, these little cherubs. One of them's looking at a rainbow. One of them's kind of drawing a shadow on a wall that's being cast by a little sun. One of them is in a mysterious room painting at the lower right. And at the lower left, most interestingly, one of these little cherubs is holding a prism up to a little hole in a wall and projecting undivided light into its divided color constituencies, which are then visualized as a circle, which we see in the center of the image. And this, we'll talk about where this came from about 70 years earlier in a moment. But I did just want to tell Billy that why do Macintoshes use a spinning rainbow of death to say, nice try, buddy, I'm thinking, or I'm dying. It used to be a kind of black and white spinning circle, kind of like the BMW logo. And before that, it was a little watch. I'm just old enough, tragically, to remember the watch. But why? Why should it be a spinning rainbow, this triggering and unnerving symbol? And the reason is that Steve Jobs got fired from Apple in the 1980s. He started a computer company called Next, which was incredibly fancy computers that were too fancy to really work economically. Nobody wanted to buy them. And he used the most advanced disk drive that was available in the mid-1980s, which was called a magneto-optical drive, which had a laser on one side and an electromagnet on the other. And you can distort through a laser the behavior of an electromagnetic field. This is high-tech magic. The power of light and the power of electromagnetism. Some listening to me may be old enough to remember compact discs, the kind of circular mirror that looks sort of has a prismatic effect because of how it's loaded. And the magneto-optical drive was the really fancy version of this way of storing information on a circular reflective disc called a mirror. And the fun thing that I couldn't resist telling Billy is that this effect, this interaction between light and electromagnetic forces was discovered in the 1860s by a physicist named John Kerr. And for that reason, it's called the surface magneto-optic Kerr effect. And the acronym for that is SMOKE, which is smoke. And someone was very clever in the 1980s when they invented that, because it's the smoke that records the information on the mirror. The mirror is the circular disc on which the information is recorded. So smoke and mirrors, my friend. Next slide. This is the Farbenkugel, which is a fun word to say in German. It means color sphere. It is a three-dimensional version of that attempt at a color system that we just saw by Ignaz Schiffermüller from 1772. This is by a painter, Philipp Otto Runge, done in the year of his very early death in 1810. And this looks like the work of a scientist, but right away I want to tell you that Runge was a romantic and an artist and a mystic, and he believed in all sorts of strange things. And he's important to our story because he wrote many letters to Goethe, the inescapable German intellectual of the 18th century, a very significant figure. If you haven't heard of him, get a liberal arts education. He wrote and wrote to many people across Europe, and one of them was to this young painter. And this painter wrote to Goethe, there are only three colors, yellow, red, and blue. Everybody knows this. And yet here in the Farbenkugel, we see many more colors. But this young painter, Runge, was a mystic. And to him, this wasn't only science, it was religion, because these three colors, yellow, red, and blue, stood for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost of the Catholic Trinity. And he had all sorts of strange and mysterious thoughts about that. So this looks like a work of science, but in many ways it's an act of faith. And I think that's important when we think about color and we think about color theory. And just to let you know, I love this image because the images below are not a bird's eye view and a elevation, they are cross sections. So the Farbenkugel was a kind of crystalline sphere with colors all the way to its heart. And he was really trying to turn the spinning rainbow of death into a three-dimensional object, and it inspired, interestingly, not so much artists, but chemists in the 19th century as they were thinking about scientific theories of color, building on this artistic theory of color. Next. So 1810 is the color sphere. these are watercolor drawings by Goethe, and the one on the right is from his book, which was called The Theory of Color, or The Theory of Colors, I should say, more precisely, written in 1810, the same year as the Farbenkugel, and translated into English in 1840. And on the right, we see another spinning rainbow of death, right? We see this kind of circular spectrum of color arranged in this way that people had been starting to kind of arrange it as early as the 1770s. And if you look at the lettering on this kind of prismatic circle, and if you can read German, in the outer ring, you will read 4 qualities of personality, which are melancholic, choleric, sanguineous, and phlegmatic. If we look on the left, this is actually a ring that Goethe made much earlier, about 10 years earlier, called the Rose of Temperaments. And rose in this sense refers to the compass rose. So it was a compass of temperaments. And that ring of color was a secondary element. And the main theory that Goethe was working on then was a theory of types of people, weirdly. And so there was this ambient theory which dated to the Middle Ages and actually all the way back to the classical world of these 4 types of people: melancholic, choleric, sanguineous, and phlegmatic. And these are words you might recognize, like a melancholic person is sad, a choleric person is angry, a sanguineous person is kind of relaxed and cool, and a phlegmatic person is like, I'm phlegmatic, I'm a nerd, like without emotion. Choler refers to bile, like vomit, basically. Melancholia refers to black bile, which was a different one of the 4 humors. Sanguineous refers to blood. Phlegmatic refers to phlegm. So it's really embodied and gross. And this kind of weird ancient medical theory that these 4 elements in the body corresponded to elements in nature, earth and fire and air. So it all is kind of astrological and personality types and thinking about people. And I don't have an image to show you, but this thinking about categorizing people even extended to the shape of people and the color of people. There was a kind of pseudoscience of phenotypes. And there's like different shapes of head that you're supposed to have if you are one of these 4 types. So if you were phlegmatic, which I apparently am, you have a big forehead. You know, in the 21st century, it all seems like pseudoscience, but this was even extending to types of body, categorizing people by these 4 humors. And then within the humors, corresponding to these 12 colors, we see tyrants, heroes, adventurers, hedonists, lovers, poets, public speakers, historians, teachers, philosophers, and rulers. Those are the 12 kinds of people, apparently. And of course, because this is a system made by a philosopher, he gets the best color, in my opinion, which is blue. So this is all by way of saying that there's a kind of impulse towards categories. And categorizing people actually preceded, in Goethe's work, categorizing color. And I think that's interesting. Even though his theory of color was extraordinarily influential on future philosophers and future artists and scientists. I'm going to spend more time on this slide than probably any other, because there's something called color theory. And you've probably heard that. You've been like, yeah, color deserves a theory. And the distinction of Goethe's color theory and the critique that it got from his peers, he had a kind of frenemy called Schopenhauer, and he had a much later reader called Ludwig Wittgenstein, who you may have heard of, late 19th and early 20th century philosopher. And Schopenhauer's critique of Goethe's theory of color is that it wasn't a theory. He was just describing his theory of color in a way that was very personal and very subjective, and indeed not what we would think of as theoretical at all. And in his theory of color, he writes about the allegorical, symbolic, and mystic use of color. He writes, red is beautiful, orange is noble, yellow is good, green is useful, blue is common, violet is unnecessary. And so we think this is a theory. The most useful distinction, and the one that will lead to the next slide, is the analysis of Wittgenstein, who wrote, in the very last thing he wrote in 1950, before he died, he was trying to write about Goethe's theory of color. And he wrote, Goethe's theory is not a theory at all. Nothing can be predicted with it. It's something we find in James's psychology. James was an American psychologist. And then he writes, I believe what Goethe was really seeking was not a physiological, but a psychological theory of color. A psychological theory of color. So let's go to the next slide. Keep that idea of a psychological theory with you. So here, on the right-hand side, is the guy that Goethe was responding to. This is Sir Isaac Newton. And in 1704, about a century before Goethe, Newton wrote an extremely influential book called Optics. We're about to see it. And this was about 15 years after Newton's first great book on gravity and calculus that you may have heard of, the Principia. But he got really interested in light and in optics. So here he is. This is an illustration from the Victorian age, so it's totally anachronistic. To me, he looks like a magician. What he's doing is holding up a little prism to a pinhole camera, like the cherub in the first slide, and projecting a spectrum and revealing it. And on the left-hand side, you see a random image that showed up on my Instagram feed about a book called, what was it called? I don't have it in front of me. It's a book about taking photographs of your aura. And this is like updated for Instagram. And this photographer, who is not Meg Thompson, but someone else, has a device for taking photos of your energetic aura. And what I like about these images together is, on the one hand, there's this intuition that color is what transcends theory. It's in the realm of the magic, the mystic. Reading auras is kind of a hippie, witchy thing to do. And Newton himself loved magic. He believed in alchemy. He believed in fairies. He believed in all sorts of things that we would today call like New Age, even though we think of him as, in some ways, the original scientist of the scientific revolution in the age of the Enlightenment in 1687. Actually, the way he thought about the world was much stranger. And color exists at this boundary between the theorizable and the non-theorizable. And for these philosophers, and if I could, I would spend a lot of time, to Billy's great anxiety, giving you a history of philosophy. But what color does, and we see it in the work of Goethe, Schopenhauer, Wittgenstein, Schiller, and others, is it destabilizes two fundamental philosophical categories: metaphysics, which is the nature of things, and epistemology, which is the nature of knowledge. Because color is a thing, but it's also weirdly a way of knowing. And Goethe was like freaked out by the fact that if he stared at a yellow light and closed his eyes, he would see a blue after image. And he would think, where is that coming from? And this was before modern medicine had an answer. So destabilizing metaphysics and epistemology at the boundary between things and knowledge. Next slide. Theories of color. On the left is a theory of coffee. This is a color wheel that has been adapted to how coffee tastes. So you, if you're tasting something that is other, right, you can eventually decide that it is phenolic. On the right is something called the feeling wheel. Gloria Wilcox, a psychologist, in October of 1982, wrote a paper where she designed this color wheel for feelings. And she had this idea that you have primary and secondary and complementary feelings, just as we have, as Goethe established in his theory of color, primary, secondary, and complementary emotions. And so while Newton was looking at physical colors and Goethe was looking at psychological colors, now Wilcox is using color as a way of understanding psychology. So if I'm feeling bad, I get to decide if I'm feeling tired. And then if I'm feeling tired, I get to decide if I'm merely unfocused or sleepy, which I'm both right now. So I love this cultural legacy of the spinning rainbow of death and of the color wheel. And I love the idea of a mashup between the coffee wheel and the feeling wheel. And you could like change your feelings by drinking just the right flavor of coffee, right? Because you would find the complementary color. And if you were feeling bored, you would drink the vegetal tasting coffee. So wheels, colors, feelings, coffee. Next. Optics, or a treatise on the reflections, refractions, inflections, and colors of light. This is the book by Isaac Newton, who we just saw. And there, figure 11 is the original color wheel from 1704 that Newton really like stabilized and established. And there were previous models for visualizing color, but Newton's wheel from 1704 really like stabilized and consolidated this way of visualizing color. And you can see in these line drawings prisms and other diagrams of optics. Note that the image is black, white, and red. There was not color printing in 1704. What there was red. And there's an amazing history to red in the history of printing. Red does not count as a color in printmaking, and that goes back to the Middle Ages. And there's a word for red printing, which is rubrication, which is Latin for reddening. So if I'm rubricating, I'm making a red line. And a rubric has therefore become, figuratively, an authoritative rule, a statute, a customary criteria, a system of categories. So you say, under this rubric, violet is a useless color, right? Under the rubric of Goethe. So this very word, rubric, Latin for reddening, has become, in English, the word for a system of analysis or a system of power. A rubric and a rubrication, and I think that matters. Next slide. Here's another book, and we see more rubrication on the title page. Grammaire de l'art du dessin. Forgive my French accent. This book is from 1860. It's by a guy called Charles Blanc, which is the perfect name for someone who cared about color, right? Charles White. White light being, as Newton said, the light that contains all other colors. Charles Blanc is important to us as architects because he was the first director of the Beaux-Arts School of Architecture in Paris in the 1840s. He got the job because his brother was a politico. And he lived in a time in the 19th century where you tried to have theories of everything. The intellectual obsession of the 19th century was the obsession of taxonomy. Again, remember I talked about different types of people associated with different types of color. And Charles Blanc was interested in different types of everything. And in the 19th century, you would get books like this, which would be just a treatise on pretty much everything. So it was like the internet in a single book. And so Charles Blanc wrote a book which was a grammar of art, design, architecture, sculpture, and painting, right? And so he had a theory of the system of Greek temples, which you see at the lower left. He had a theory of facial expressions, which he reduced to a system of 7 lines. And that's a famous image at the bottom there. And of course, he had his own kind of color wheel, which was actually a color star. And he had particular ideas about the intensity of these colors, which would later, although Blanc was coming out of art, these theories would interest future scientists, partially because the scientists were trying to understand how to print color, which you could by 1860, by the time of this book. And so RGB, CMYK, luminance, chroma, intensity, all of these phrases you find in your Photoshop menus, they were actually invented in the 19th century by understanding printing books on color. So Charles Blanc, kind of the 19th century would-be theorist of everything, right? Including color. Next slide. So Charles Blanc, Internet in a Book. Charles Blanc seems like an old-fashioned figure. He seems like the Beaux-Arts School of Architecture. What could be more old-fashioned than that? Charles Blanc heavily influenced Johannes Itten. Johannes Itten was the teacher of Joseph Albers at a school called the Bauhaus, and I do hope you've heard of that school. It was the one of the ground zero of modern architecture in Dessau, Germany, between the wars. Albers began as a student, quickly became a teacher. His partner, Annie Albers, oversaw the weaving and fabric and textile teaching at the Bauhaus. So Charles Blanc heavily influenced Johannes Itten, Itten, who taught at the Bauhaus, deeply influenced Albers. And indeed, Charles Blanc was still alive when Albers was born. So this book, Interaction of Color, is really just the 1963 version of Charles Blanc's 1860 book. And Albers has his own ideas about color. And this is a really beautiful optical illusion, speaking of magic tricks, where the 2 small squares, which appear to be different colors, are actually the same color. And they only appear different because they are seen against different fields of color, green above, orange below. So Albers was really interested not so much in color, but in the interactions between colors. And that was his theory of color. There he is in the upper left looking very serious. He did a bunch of paintings of colored squares, which were very influential in their own way. It's important to know that Albers was a kind of social climber. He started off life as a artisan of stained glass. And by joining the Bauhaus, he proceeded both professionally and socially up into the realms of art in the academy. Keep that thought in your mind too. Next slide. The Bauhaus was a white building. When we think of early modern architecture, we think of white buildings. The whiteness of early modern architecture. There's a beautiful, brilliant book called White Walls Design Addresses by Mark Wigley. who's a former dean of the school where I teach, GSAP at Columbia, also a New Zealander. We won't hold that against him. And just an extraordinary theorist about the language and the history of architecture. And in this book, White Walls, Design Addresses, he talks about how the whiteness of early modern architecture is kind of hiding in plain sight. It's always there and we don't quite think about it. He talks about whiteness and femininity, which is why this photo you see on the left, which is the Weissenhof Siedlung, town planned by Mies van der Rohe with contributions from all the early modern architects you probably heard of, including Le Corbusier, whose housing unit this is, Unit 15, is actually the color of his book, White Walls, Design Addresses. Weissenhof, the perfect name by accident. It means hope for whiteness, or white hope. The essential point of Wigley's book is that the whiteness of early modern architecture is not neutral. It has an agenda of its own. It's concealing something and revealing something. And I'll send you to that book to go deeper into his theory. He talks about ornament and the lack of ornament, and he maps this onto discourses of masculinity and femininity, and to discourses of materiality as well. It's a book that I continue to learn from. And the main takeaway I'm sharing with you now is just this idea that white is not neutral. White is a color. Interestingly, we know most of these early modern buildings through black and white photography, right? So we think of them as black and gray and white, whereas in fact, they did have color. On the lower right, you see the interior of this building. You see that rosy pink wall and that pale blue element in the front. And Le Corbusier, the designer of this, was actually also obsessed with color. He was a failed painter. And he had all sorts of failed businesses with paint companies and wallpaper companies in which he tried to kind of perfect his own color system. Next slide. And so for the color of his two most influential books, Version Architecture, which I hope you've heard of, which is a compilation of his articles for an avant-garde design magazine, and L'Art Décoratif d'Aujourd'hui, you see he actually uses those same colors that he was obsessed with, that he used in the interior of that building. So the ocean liner, which is the picture on the cover of Version Architecture, is white. And it's this white of early modernism, this non-neutral, neutral-seeming white. But it is in this sea of pale blue. I think that's interesting. Next slide. This is the tuberculosis sanatorium by Alvar Aalto at a town called Paimo, circa 1926-7-8. There's a theory of the origin of the whiteness of early modern architecture, which has to do with the global pandemic. And I thought I would touch on this since we are experiencing a global pandemic now. This theory was consolidated by the brilliant architectural historian Beatrice Colomina, who interestingly is the partner of Mark Wigley. And she describes this tuberculosis sanatorium, which was designed and built before the germ theory of disease as applied to tuberculosis was fully understood and before the discovery of penicillin, this wonder drug, right? Got to get that vaccine. Penicillin was the vaccine against this plague. Tuberculosis was called the White Plague. Interesting use of the word white in contrast to the Black Plague of the Middle Ages. Colomina describes this tuberculosis sanatorium. Its clean-lined bedrooms, void of ornament, were designed to minimize surfaces where dust could accumulate. Even the intersection of floor and wall beneath the window curved to stop dust. Door handles were carefully designed not to catch the sleeves of the doctor's white coats. you see there is some color there too, but there's a lot of whiteness there too. Next slide. So think about the whiteness of the white coat of the doctor. Think about the whiteness of the clinic. Think about the whiteness of the hospital. This is not a hospital. This is an art museum. This is an art gallery. It is the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. 1973, last building by the architect Gerrit Rietveld. I want to read to you a passage written in 1976. Inside the White Cube, the ideology of the gallery space, by an art critic called Brian O'Doherty. And like Mark Wigley, he's interested in how the seemingly neutral white is not neutral. The outside world must not come in, so windows are usually sealed, walls are painted white. The ceiling becomes the only source of light. The floor is polished so that you are clicking along clinically. There's that word clinic, right? Clinic, hospital, tuberculosis, white plague. Or carpeted so you pan along soundlessly, resting the feet while the eyes habit the wall. The art is supposedly free to take on its own life. So, inside the White Cube, the ideology of the gallery space. So this is the whitest, cubiest gallery I could find for you. Next slide. This is the top floor of that same gallery. The guy on the sofa is the grandnephew of the painter Van Gogh. You see Van Gogh's painting along the walls. I love how these people are dressed. They're like total hipsters of 1973. I really admire the hairstyle of the guy at left. The woman at right is possibly the Queen of the Netherlands, but she's kind of casual. And this nephew of, or grandnephew of Van Gogh is being presented with a view of a painting called The Yellow House by Van Gogh. Next slide. Here's the painting, The Yellow House, circa 1888, May of 1888. It's also known as The House and Its Environment, which I like. There are lots of theories about Van Gogh, that he was crazy, right? We know he cut off his ear, we know he killed himself. But he was a real scholar. And we know a lot about his life because he wrote letters continuously to his brother Theo. And so because of these letters, we know that when he was in this house, he was reading Charles Blanc's book on color theory, among other things. And so he was an artist, but he was thinking like a scientist, which is one definition of what it means to be an architect. He hated having his photo taken. We don't actually know if that's a photo of him at the upper right, speaking of the magic of the image, but we think it's him. He wrote to his brother from this very house. His studio was the little building in front on the top floor. He wrote, "I start from the colors on my palette, not from the colors in nature." Right? That's interesting. He writes to his brother, "Color expresses something in itself. Color is not the representation of something else. Color expresses something in himself." I'm not sure what he means by that, but I find it interesting. He starts with what's on his palette, not with what's in nature. Color expresses something in itself. So remember epistemology, remember metaphysics. Van Gogh is trying to get at something, I think, with the complement of blue and yellow, which he studied in Charles Blanc and applied in his painting. Next slide. Okay, this is a grab bag slide. The theme of this slide is things you think you thought were colored, but actually were not, and things you thought were not colored, but actually were. And this idea of color, the idea of the purity of whiteness or colorlessness in contrast to the artifice of color. That guy in the black top in the middle on the bottom, that's Gerrit Rietveld at the end of his career. when he was a very distinguished architect, when he was designing the Van Gogh Museum. There he is, lower right, with his family at the Meubelmakerij, which is the furniture maker. So he started off as a carpenter. His father was a joiner, a kind of fine woodworker. And he eventually ascended, he socially climbed into architecture. A lot of the great dead white men of this generation are real social climbers. Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, Gerrit Rietveld. And he climbed, interestingly, by adding color to a wooden chair. He designed this chair in 1917. It was plain wood. And then in 1918, he joined something called De Stijl, which was a movement of artists and thinkers in the Netherlands, De Stijl. And in 1918, he decided he would paint this chair, black, red, blue, and yellow. These primary colors. So primary, right? Getting back to something essential at the middle of the color rainbow. But also it's artifice, right? It's an applied image to the vulnerable, humble carpenter wood below. On the left, you see a reconstruction of his furniture in plain wood. Over here further on the left, you have the phenomenon of polychromy, which means many colors. In the 18th century, which is when neoclassicism in architecture began, contemporary with the age of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution begun by Newton in 1704 and 1687, people were really excited for classical ruins, and they invented neoclassicism, and they didn't realize that the faded stone ruins used to be painted. And in the 19th century, along came real archaeologists, and they were kind of freaked out. They were like, oh my God, all of these noble temples were actually really cheesy, and they were covered in color. So that's a reconstruction of the Parthenon at the upper left from the 19th century. And there's a wonderful phrase I can't resist reading to you from an art historian called Emerson, descendant of the philosopher, if you know him. The evidence of archaeology is too strong to admit quibble or doubt. So strong was the deference for the antique learned from the Italian masters of the Renaissance that the accidental destruction of the ancient coloring had been exalted into special merit and ridiculously associated with the ideal qualities of the highest art, of unsullied purity, right? Whiteness and purity. There's one to kind of do the thinking emoji on, right? Next slide. Okay, so why do architects wear black? Gerrit Rietveld, once he ascended into architecture, wore black. This is a stupid image I found on the internet of who will win the Pritzker Prize. I think that's Lacaton and Vassal at the lower right, who actually did win. Good for them. There's lots of people on this grid who, I don't know if they should win. I don't know. I don't know what it even means to win, but it just gives us a nice grab bag of the sort of social and fashionable self-presentation of the architect, both their expressions, their haircuts, and their clothes. Most of them are wearing black. Why is that? Next slide. Here are architects wearing black. These are famous architects. These are the so-called starchitects of the 90s and aughts, who really fixed the image of the architect in the mind of the general public. Basically, Dr. Evil, James Bond villain in a black turtleneck, that's the architect. There's Rem Koolhaas, Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel in the upper left. That's in the early 90s. There's beautiful young Rem Koolhaas wearing a businessman's suit before he got established as an architect. So before he has power as a designer, he has to mimic the clothing of his client. And we see his client there in a pinstriped banker's suit. Maybe it's a fancy journalist, but I think it's a client. And it's interesting that he abandons this dress once he establishes himself as an architect and instead wears black. Next slide. That's Frida Escobedo from that same internet page. a wonderful and meaningful contemporary architect. She's wearing a little black dress, an LBD. That is a kind of social uniform, gendered, invented by the woman at upper left, Coco Chanel, in the 1920s. That's actually the spread from Vogue magazine, in which the little black dress was introduced to the world. Coco Chanel called it luxurious poverty. I think that's a very telling phrase. Basically, she appropriated the black clothes of her own servant. Servants wore black in the late 19th century. Before that, they wore the hand-me-downs of their employers. And if you read the social history of the 19th century, there were all these moments when they were kind of confused for their bosses. So it was decided in the Victorian age that servants should wear black. Also, it doesn't show dirt because servants are members of the working class. Vogue magazine called it Chanel's Model T. The Model T Ford was also only available in black. It was the car of the working class. It was the democratic car. So the little black dress and the Ford Model T have a lot to say to each other. I love the juxtaposition of this portrait of Frida Escobedo and really the first modern architect, I would say, which is Vasari, architect of the Renaissance, a really bad painter and a mediocre architect, but a wonderful art historian and a servant of Cosimo de' Medici. And Medici said, "You are my servant, even though you are also a gentleman and a learned man, and you're adding class to my court. You're still my servant, you're gonna wear black." And so he wears black with a beautiful necklace. And so does Frida Escobedo wear black with a beautiful necklace. So I think it's got to do with the class system and the social ambiguity of the architect as an intellectual, but also as a servant to a client, and as often especially in the generation of Gerrit Rietveld, someone who kind of moves from the working class to the upper class, but is kind of ambiguously suspended between the two. We architects work with our hands as well as with our minds. We're information workers, but also we're just workers. So the blackness of architects' clothes, I'm obsessed with it. Now, hopefully you are. Next slide. This is an artist. You can tell he's really wishing that he's smoking a cigarette. He's an artist and a painter, just as Vasari was also a painter, just as Corbusier was also a painter. I just kind of love him because he had some fun things to say about wearing black. "I've worn black for years," he said in a June 2020 podcast. "And the advantage of wearing things that are black is that you never have to decide what color to wear. I do occasionally indulge in a magenta sweater. Remember that Goethe said magenta is useless. It's the color of idleness, of relaxation, not of use, but of the opposite of use, of luxury. Purple, the color of royalty." But it's kind of an aside, and everybody knows it's kind of an aside. There are conceptual reasons behind it. Craig Martin says, "To some designers, it's a matter of utility. I'm a fan of Yohji Yamamoto, fashion designer, much beloved of architects, designs a lot of black clothes. Yamamoto said, 'Black is modest and arrogant at the same time,' which I think is also a great description of an architect, modest and arrogant at the same time. Black is lazy, but mysterious. But above all," Yohji Yamamoto says, "Black says, 'I don't bother you, you don't bother me.'" That's Craig Martin quoting Yamamoto. Next slide. Here's a painting by Craig Martin of a building by Le Corbusier. I pray to God you know which building this is. If you Google modern architecture, image search, this is literally the first building that comes up. It's the Villa Savoie outside of Paris from the mid-1920s, lifted above the ground to protect the occupant from that white plague of tuberculosis, which was believed to exist in the damp miasmas of the ground. The client, Madame Savoie, her son, suffered, we think, from tuberculosis, which is why she wanted an elevated house. She wanted a White House, like a clinic. But this painter decided to do it in colors because he's cool. Now Australia comes into my story. Some of you may recognize the Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, the AIA-TSIS in Canberra, designed by RMA or ARM architects, who I think are from Melbourne. We won't hold that against them. This is maybe the craziest building I've ever seen. I love it, I hate it, I don't get it. Why would you build this institute in the form of a black version of a white building by Le Corbusier from the 1920s? I want to read you a quote from its architect. What the clients did not want for this project was Aboriginal architecture. They did not want a building that somehow separated them from the contemporary world. As for the use of the Villa Savoye as a blurred and emergent element of the design, it can clearly be read in the context of the overall concept. Villa Savoye makes perfect office accommodation, but it is also a figure in the landscape. The idea of a black Savoye is an understanding of local versions, a kind of inversion, a reflection. There's reflection, right, which was a word that Newton introduced into the English language, using the word X, reflection, refraction, these things that light did. He invented those words, but also a kind of shadow, the architect says. All ideas explored in the design of the museum himself. That was in Architecture Australia in 2001. So whiteness turned to blackness. I think tacit in this, consciously or not, is something to do with, in English, the way we use the language of color to talk about something we call race. Next slide. This is my favorite slide of this presentation. Billy, we're almost done. That's Queen Elizabeth I on the left in a portrait painting by an otherwise not very distinguished painter, probably Dutch, like Van Gogh. It's called The Rainbow Portrait. It does not feature a spinning rainbow of death, but it does feature a rainbow. Queen Elizabeth I is holding a rainbow in her right hand. That's what that weird object is. This is a mystical and allegorical portrait, and it's actually about vision. And if you look at the fabric of her dress, you see that there are a bunch of eyes. So Queen Elizabeth sees you. She was actually famous for her network of spies. She had a great surveillance network. And there's this quotation written onto the painting, non sine sole iris, which means without the sun, there is no rainbow, which basically means without the queen, there is no peace. Queen Elizabeth I famously defeated Charles V, the King of Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, which is why I'm giving you this talk in English. Here in America and Australia, it's why we're speaking English and not Spanish, perhaps. At least that's what this portrait of Queen Elizabeth is maybe made to make you think. It was painted around 1600, around the year of Elizabeth's death. So it was a kind of summary of herself, ageless, eternal, allegorical, mystical. Everything in this painting stands for something else. But I really want to direct your attention to the fact that she's just randomly holding a rainbow. Just as in a way, in that 19th century image of Sir Isaac Newton, he was kind of holding a beam of light through a prism, like a magician. I love this painting on the right. It's actually here in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's by Diego Velázquez, who is probably my favorite painter, who painted for the court of Philip IV in Spain, the descendant of the king that Elizabeth on the left defeated. He was like, as Vasari was the court painter for Medici, Diego Velázquez was the court painter for Philip IV. This painting, man, this guy could be a king, and perhaps was a king, virtually speaking. And like Queen Elizabeth I, he is holding a rainbow in his right hand. You cannot see the rainbow. The rainbow is figurative. This was the artist who mixed the colors, who mixed the paints for Velázquez. He was the king of colors. He was Velázquez's kind of studio assistant, and he went on to become a significant painter in his own right. He was an enslaved person when Velázquez produced this painting, but Velázquez, who was also a kind of bureaucrat in the court, secured this person's manumission and freedom around the time that he painted this portrait. There's even a theory that the subject of this portrait is also its author, that this painting may not be by Velázquez, it may be by this individual who's known as Juan de Pareja. Pareja in Spanish means partner, which I like because of the possibility that professionally speaking, Juan de Pareja was the partner of Velázquez, and in some ways his equal, if not in the incredibly hierarchical Spanish court, but maybe in the kingdom of art. And there are some really interesting paintings which are convincingly attributed to Juan de Pareja, which continue Velázquez's work. Interestingly, for architects, Velázquez never drew. He just painted. He never did an underdrawing. He used pure color. That may be why I love Velázquez so much. Juan de Pareja was probably descended from Ghana and from the Berber people of North Africa and the Ghanaian people of West Africa. His family probably was in Spain for many generations. And in the 15th century, you kind of had the choice between becoming enslaved or leaving Spain. It's possible that Juan de Pareja was a descendant of one of these families, or it's possible that Juan de Pareja grew up in West Africa or in the kind of Berber region of North Africa, or both. We're not sure. There isn't a documentary history. But I think this kind of, in every sense of the word in English, colorful presence is significant. I want to stay on this slide just a little bit longer. I know we got to watch the time, Billy. We didn't always use the word white to mean a person of African descent. We didn't always use the word colored or black to speak of someone from African descent. This happened in the 17th century. In literature, it dates to around 1610. A play by Thomas Middleton, a contemporary of Shakespeare. A black character in this play uses the line, I see amazement set upon the faces of these white people, wonderings and strange gazes, right? There's looking and seeing again. This painting on the left is all about vision and looking and seeing. And in 1691, just a few years before Newton's physics about the physical nature of light, in the New World in North America, the word white was introduced into a rubric, into a law for the first time. Whatsoever English or other white man being free shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman, bond or free, shall within 3 months after marriage be banished. So this statute was trying to regulate labor, interestingly. This is a theory that comes from a scholar called Nell Irvin Painter. I'm fascinated by her work, not only because she writes about this use of the language of color for the language of race in America in the 17th century, also because when she retired from being a historian, she actually became a painter. And so one of the subjects of this talk is painting, and so Nell Irvin Painter became a painter. She was a Ghanaian American worker I think that's significant. Last slide, Billy. The next one. No, let's just stop at that one of the maps. Back one more. Or we can stop here. These are absolutely contemporary, 1935. On the left is a map of Brooklyn, New York, which practiced something called redlining, which is a form of racial segregation. Notice the word red, a red color. Red means stop, green means go. It had to do with whether you could get a mortgage from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was established in the Depression. A lot of people in architecture in America are contending with the legacy of redlining and its kind of segregation of people. And Brooklyn remains in many ways segregated, as you see in this 1935 map. On the right is a 1935 diagram by Alfred Barr, the founding director of MoMA. It's just interesting to me that it's also a red-lined map in a way. There are red lines, there's rubrication, and the things that get red lines around them are Japanese prints, Near Eastern art, Negro sculpture, and machine aesthetics. So other ethnicities and machines get red boxes. Modern architecture gets a black box. Next and truly last slide. I called this talk the spinning rainbow of death because that's what hackers call that thing. This is a spinning rainbow of life. This is a study by W.E.B. Du Bois, who is an amazing, significant historian, activist, leader around the turn of the 20th century. There's a scholarship by Mabel Wilson, who's an architectural historian. I'm fortunate to call her my colleague at Columbia. She writes about the history of cartography. Cartography spatialized the scale and scope of the Black diaspora from the local to the global. Historically, along with the creation of maps, critical tools in the European colonial project, there emerged a cartographic gaze, there's that word gaze again, that cultivated a way of seeing the world through evolving cartographic technologies and new modes of representing a world. So by re-representing a world, W.E.B. Du Bois changes the world. So this spinning rainbow of life is W.E.B. Du Bois' diagram on the right-hand side of economic progress by Black Americans. And the longest line, which happens to be a red line, is the value of not houses and homes, but of domestic goods by what were then called Negro households in the state of Georgia. And so I just kind of love that this is another circular rainbow. And W.E.B. Du Bois, you see his quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." There's that word color. And so what are colors? What are lines? These are questions for architects. So this history that I just blasted my way through is designed not to be conclusive, but to give you a kind of open end and a way into seeing and working through the objective realities and subjective constructions of color. How's that, Billy?
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tomas. We'll give you a virtual clap. It's hard to hear it, but I can see it's happening in the studios and on the screen. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Irena, I don't know. We might, if there's no time for questions, I might bring you into my studio for a discussion. But
I'm sorry that I ran out the clock. I really don't mean this to be a sage on a stage. This is a conversation. So it's a conversation, at least in spirit. I wanted to have some time for us to talk back and forth a little bit, but I'm very open to doing that with any of you, anytime, as a kind of pretend Newcastle stowaway. I'm very open to keeping our conversation going. These are all questions, not answers. This is just stuff I'm thinking about, and I want to hear what you think about it too.
Are there any questions, Irena? What?
I think I think it can be the perfect moment. So we have time because we are in the middle of the studio, and yeah. But I mean, I think it's the perfect time. If Billy invite you again for tutorial, so just let me know, please, Billy, because I will join you. But anyway, this is another thing, but I'm sure it's the perfect moment to continue the questions, because for the conversation, that is more a question than other things. Thank you very much, because it has been an amazing lecture, and it's not a compliment. I'm fascinated. I'm just sitting in front, listening this beautiful manner in which you have been kind of navigating us through the history of architecture and knowledge and physics and artists and yeah. Thank you, Thomas. It's amazing, really.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just your whole kind of the way that you unpack an idea, you know, an idea around color, but you're able to kind of connect it to so many different things, I think has so much resonance for all of us. And yes, it's amazing to kind of see the complexity of the kind of argument that you're making. So I want to thank you again for taking your time. It's now midnight, or, you know, just past midnight. You know, you're gonna turn to pumpkin any minute. Yeah, exactly. But you know, I just wanted to thank you again, you know, with everyone here, and I'll talk to you individually and get you into my group for some questions.
What I would add, sort of answering an unasked question for the benefit of the students, is that this interest in color really grew out of a shared interest between Billy and I in a very basic architectural dilemma, and one that I think students have, which is that you are designing an architectural object which has its own discipline, a formal discipline, a material discipline, a spatial discipline, and you are also designing an architectural experience, right? So once again, we have kind of metaphysics in the object, and epistemology in the experience, and the kind of art and science of perception and subjectivity. And what does it mean to design objectively and design subjectively? What does it mean to design, you know, universally in a way that has an openness, but what does it mean to design personally and that has a kind of position? My own interest in color probably came out of some of these very fundamental questions about learning and teaching design. I'm still thinking about them. I'm still trying to figure them out. You know, this idea of categories, as I said, like this tendency to divide people into categories is even maybe informed Goethe's idea of dividing color into categories. Or I don't know, like that Virginia statute was just a little bit before Newton. So culture and science, the subjective and the objective, the historically situated and the scientifically transcendent are all kind of messing with each other. And as architects, we're right in the middle. We're right in between the seen and the unseen world, right? Like Newton, like that magician, we're taking the unseen and we're making it seen. We're taking invisible social forces and we're working with them physically and visibly with the built environment. So that's why I'm really excited about this kind of language of color and the way that it applies culturally, socially, historically. That as architects, we're kind of mediating between the seen and the unseen, between the acknowledged and the unacknowledged, between systems of power and systems of space or material practice. And so we're kind of right in the middle of this as architects, whether we want to be or not. And so the sooner we kind of try to wrestle with these angels, the better. And I'm not saying that there is a conclusive answer, that circle comes full circle. Notice that W.E.B. Du Bois' circle was kind of like open. It just sort of kept going. Maybe like that circle spins. So we all kind of need to keep spinning it together. So that's my answer to an unasked question, but I really am open to continuing the conversation with anyone who would like to.
Well, I also think that, I mean, there's obviously a tremendous amount to unpack in the presentation. It's a good thing it's on Zoom because we have the ability to watch it several times, which I know I'll be doing. So, so thank you again, Tomas, and thank you everyone for joining us. And And Tomas, I'm going to send you a text message with a link if you want to pop in the studio now.
I'm delighted. And to my brothers and sisters at Newcastle, thank you so much for letting me just tell you what's on my mind, giving me the privilege of speaking out loud. It's a real honor, and I'm delighted to see some of you again, and I'm delighted to tune in Newcastle a little bit as well. And thank you again, Irene, for letting me be a stowaway in this studio. It's a joy.
If you're happy with that, we're going to invite you soon. We would like to invite you soon. And the reason why it's called Visiting Architect and Expert, which is a word that I don't think architects in general likes, is because we want to open to other field of knowledge and other people that we cannot be called architects.
Yes.
And the idea is that we are going to kind of inviting people over and over again, hopefully. So let's leave the invitation open. Hopefully you can come to Australia soon, and then it can be a face-to-face one instead.
I would love it. Yeah. My Australian family would be delighted.
Yeah.
I get to go for a nice swim in Balmain.
Thank you really for organizing it, and again, a big thank you so much.